She had no name on her home world. Names were for the important ones, those who held jobs that mattered, those whose lives were counted in the records. She was neither important nor counted. If her people kept track of her at all, it was only to make sure she worked. To everyone else, she was just a shape that moved in the background. They called her Scrap. It wasn't a name. It was a label, like a dirty sticker on an old machine. Scrap was what you threw away when it was useless. And that was exactly how they saw her. Every morning, she woke to the sound of metal groaning in the distance. The factory never slept. Even at night, the great machines still spat smoke into the sky. The air always smelled of oil and rust. The ground was never clean. Black dust coated her feet, her hands, even her skin, until it looked like the dirt had sunk into her bones. She lived in a small, cold room at the back of the workers' quarter. There was no door, only a curtain, made from a torn sheet of plastic. When the wind blew, it whistled through the holes in the walls and made her shiver. There was a bed, but it was made of old pallets stacked together with a thin blanket that could barely keep out the cold. She often woke up aching, but that was normal. Pain had always been normal. Her job was simple, but endless. Clean the waste from the machines. When the grinders chewed through raw ore, they spat out chunks of rock and clouds of dust. She swept the floors, carried the scrap metal into bins, and hauled the bins to the dumping ground outside the city. The bins were heavy, almost too heavy for her thin arms, but she had no choice. If she slowed down, someone would yell. If she dropped something, someone would hit her. No one thanked her. No one looked at her face. Most people didn't even speak to her unless they were giving orders. Sometimes, she wondered if she had become like the machines only noticed when she stopped working. The other workers didn't hate her. Hating her would mean she mattered. They simply didn't care. She was part of the background, like the dull gray walls or the noise of the engines. She could stand in a doorway and watch 100 people walk past without a single one of them meeting her eyes. It wasn't that they were cruel, they just didn't think about her at all. When she was younger, she used to dream about getting out. She would imagine walking into the sunlight of some far place where the air was clear, where people laughed and spoke kindly, but dreams had a way of dying here. Every year, she worked more and thought less about escape. The factory stole not just her strength, but her hope, grinding it down as easily as the machines ground stone. She ate in the communal hall with the other Lorank workers. The food was always the same: thin soup, stale bread, sometimes a piece of gray meat that tasted like nothing. She didn't speak during meals, and no one spoke to her. The voices around her blended into a dull hum, like the sound of the machines. Sometimes, she caught her reflection in the oily water she used to clean the floors. She saw a face she barely recognized, cheeks sharp from hunger, eyes dull from exhaustion, hair hanging in limp strands. She wasn't ugly, but she wasn't beautiful either. She was just forgettable, a person you could look at once and never remember again. Still, she worked, day after day. She lifted the bins, swept the floors, and carried the waste. If she didn't work, she wouldn't eat. If she didn't eat, she wouldn't live. And if she didn't live, she wondered if anyone would even notice she was gone. Some nights, lying in her narrow bed, she tried to remember if anyone had ever looked at her the way she saw others being looked at, with warmth, with interest. She couldn't think of a single time. She was invisible. She had always been invisible, and she believed it would always be that way. She didn't know that somewhere far above her world, a small human ship was moving through the black, its engines glowing like two quiet stars. She didn't know that inside it, a woman was about to make a mistake in her flight path, a mistake that would bring her down to this ugly, forgotten place. And she didn't know that this mistake would change everything, because soon, for the first time in her life, someone would see her. The human ship came without warning. It was morning when the sirens went off in the port district. At first, Everyone thought it was another factory accident, but then the loudspeakers called for the dock crews. That only meant one thing: off-world landing. Ships didn't often come here. This world wasn't on any important trade route, and its people had nothing rare to sell. The few visitors who did arrive came for scrap metal or cheap labor. They never stayed long. From her place in the factory yard, Scrap saw it through the haze, a silver shape breaking through the clouds. Sunlight flashing off its hull. It slowed, hovering for a moment, before lowering itself onto the dock platform with a hiss of steam. Its engines glowed a pale blue, fading as it settled. The locals kept their distance. Humans had a strange reputation among the stars. Some said they were dangerous, too quick to fight, too stubborn to surrender. Others said they were unpredictable, following no rules but their own. And some whispered that humans were different in a way no one could explain. Scrap didn't expect to see one up close. People like her had no reason to be near the docks. She was just another shadow in the machinery district. But curiosity was a small fire she couldn't put out, and so she lingered near the edge of the yard, pretending to sort a bin of broken parts while her eyes stayed fixed on the new arrival. The ship's ramp lowered with a deep, metallic thud. Steam rolled down like fog, curling along the platform. From the mist, a human woman appeared. She wore a worn leather jacket, her hair tied back, her boots scuffed from travel. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. She walked down the ramp slowly, scanning the dock. And then something strange happened. She smiled, not at anyone in particular, just at the people around her. She greeted the first dock worker she passed with a quick nod and a hello. The worker looked startled, then muttered something and went back to his task. The human kept going, stopping once to shake someone's hand, then to help a man lift a crate. Scrap's hands paused over the bin she was pretending to sort. No one here did that. No one smiled at strangers, and certainly no one offered help unless they were paid. The human stayed at the docks for most of the morning, speaking to traders, checking lists, and walking between stacks of cargo. She laughed easily, as though the heavy air of this world didn't press on her chest the way it pressed on everyone else's. Later, Scrap overheard two foremen talking. The human ship had come here by mistake. Some kind of navigation glitch. She was looking for supplies before heading back out. She wouldn't be here long. That should have been the end of Scrap's interest. People came, people left. The factory swallowed every day whole, and the machines didn't care who landed in the port. But she found her eyes drawn to the docks again the next day. The human was there, standing with a group of workers, laughing at something one of them said. Her laugh carried through the air, light and warm, a sound that didn't belong to this place. Scrap didn't know why, but the sight left a strange ache in her chest. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something else, something she couldn't name. She told herself it didn't matter. She was just watching because humans were rare here, because she had never seen one in person before. That was all. But deep down, in the quiet place inside her, where her thoughts were still her own, she felt something shift, a thought she hadn't let herself think in years. What would it feel like if someone looked at me the way she looks at them? The thought scared her. Hope was dangerous here. It could grow in the dark, but it never survived in the light. Still, she kept watching. She didn't know that the human had already noticed her, standing at the edge of the yard, half hidden in the shadow of a wall. She didn't know that the human had wondered why the thin, tired figure kept glancing toward the docks, and then quickly looking away. And she didn't know that the next time they met, the human wouldn't just walk past her. The third morning after the human's arrival, the sky was heavy with smoke from the smelters. Ash drifted down like slow black snow. The air was thick, tasting of burnt metal. Scrap had been up since before dawn, hauling bins of rusted machine parts from one end of the yard to the other. Her arms ached, her back throbbed, but the bins didn't care. They were heavy whether she was tired or not. She was halfway through lifting one when she heard footsteps behind her. They were lighter than the heavy boots the factory workers wore, but still confident. Before she could turn, a voice spoke clear, warm, and carrying an accent she didn't recognize. "Need help?" Scrap froze. No one asked her that. No one ever asked her that. Slowly, she turned. It was the human, the same woman she had seen at the docks, her jacket a little scuffed, her eyes bright even in the gray light of the yard. Up close, Scrap could see she wasn't much taller than the other workers. But she stood differently, like someone who belonged anywhere she decided to be. Scrap's first instinct was to shake her head, to mutter something and make the human go away. Not because she didn't need help, but because here, needing help was dangerous. If the foreman saw someone else doing her work, there would be questions. Questions led to trouble. "I no one helps me," Scrap said quietly. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. She didn't talk much to anyone, so her words came out stiff. "Well," the human said, frowning as if she'd just heard something ridiculous. "That's stupid." Before Scrap could protest, the human stepped forward, grabbed the other end of the bin, and lifted. The bin was heavy, but with two people carrying it, it no longer felt like it would crush Scrap's ribs. They carried it together across the yard. Scrap didn't speak. She was too busy trying to understand what was happening. When they set it down, the human dusted her hands and looked at her. "See? Much easier." Scrap stared at her. "Why? What? Why help me?" The human shrugged. "Because you looked like you needed it." Then she smiled, as if it was the most obvious answer in the world. Scrap didn't know what to say. People here didn't help unless there was something in it for them. No one wasted time on her. She was used to being ignored, or ordered around, or pushed aside. But this human, this stranger, had just helped, without asking for anything. The human didn't leave right away. She leaned against the wall of the yard, asking Scrap questions. What was her name? How long had she worked here? Did she like it? Scrap answered, as little as she could. She told the truth about working there a long time, but she didn't tell the truth about her name. She didn't have one, not really. And she definitely didn't say she hated the factory. Talking like that could get you punished. But the human didn't seem to mind her short answers. She kept talking, telling little stories about other planets she had visited, about skies that were green at sunset, and oceans that glittered like glass. Scrap listened without meaning to, her mind painting pictures she had never imagined before. Eventually, the human pushed herself away from the wall. "All right, I'll let you get back to it. See you around." She left with a wave, heading back toward the docks. Scrap stood there for a long moment, the weight of the empty air where the human had been pressing on her chest. She didn't understand why her heart was beating faster than usual. She didn't understand why her hands trembled, not from work, but from something else entirely. When she finally went back to hauling bins, she realized her mind was still on the human's smile. It was a strange smile, not perfect, not practiced, but real. The kind of smile that made you feel like, for a second, you were the only person in the world. No one had ever smiled at her like that before, and without meaning to, Scrap felt the smallest crack in the wall she had built around her heart. She told herself it was nothing, just a moment, just an odd human, but deep down, she knew something had changed. The human came back the next day. Scrap had convinced herself that their meeting had been an accident, a one-time moment that would fade like smoke in the factory air. But there she was again, walking into the yard as if she belonged there. She didn't wear protective gloves or a mask like the other workers. Her jacket was patched in places, her boots dusty from travel. She stood out against the dull grays and browns of the factory like a small flame in the dark. This time, she carried a metal container. "Brought you something," she said, holding it out. Scrap stared at it. "What is it?" "Food," the human said simply. Scrap hesitated. No one gave food for free. Not here. Why? She asked. The human shrugged. Because you looked hungry yesterday. Inside was bread, soft bread, not the stale, dry kind the factory served, and a strip of dried meat that smelled of spices Scrap didn't know. The moment she tasted it, her mouth flooded with warmth. It was the best thing she had eaten in years. The human didn't stay long, but the next day, she came again, and the day after that. Sometimes she brought food, sometimes just water that didn't taste like rust. Sometimes she came empty-handed, staying only to talk. Scrap didn't know how to handle it. She had spent so long being unseen that she didn't know what to do with someone who kept looking right at her. At first, she kept her answers short, but over time, words began to slip out, small pieces of her life. She told the human about the cold floor she slept on, about the way people walked through her, as if she was air. She told her about the endless days and the aching nights, about how it had been this way for as long as she could remember. The human listened, really listened. She didn't look away, didn't interrupt, didn't try to change the subject. And when Scrap faltered, she would simply nod, as if to say, "Go on, I'm still here." One afternoon, they sat in the shadow of the factory wall, away from the eyes of the foreman. The human had been telling a story about a marketplace on some faraway world, a place filled with bright fabrics and voices calling out in 100 languages. Scrap had almost been able to smell the spices and feel the warmth of a sun she'd never seen. When the story ended, the human was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Scrap with a strange softness in her eyes. "Come with me," she said. Scrap blinked. "What?" "My crew needs an extra pair of hands," the human said. "We're heading out in a few days. There's food, a bed, pay, and you wouldn't have to stay here." Scrap stared at her. The words felt unreal, like something from a dream that would vanish the moment she tried to hold on to it. "Leave," Scrap said quietly. I can't." "Why not?" Scrap opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't have an answer, not a real one. She had never thought about leaving. It was like asking a bird born in a cage why it didn't fly away. She had never imagined the door could open. The human leaned forward, her voice gentle. "You don't owe them anything. They've taken enough from you." Scrap's hands tightened in her lap. The idea was terrifying. The factory, the yard, the cold bed, these were all she knew. Out there was nothing, and maybe nothing was worse. But another part of her, a part buried so deep she had almost forgotten it, whispered that maybe out there was something. The human stood. "Think about it. I'm not going to force you. But I'll be here until we leave. If you want to come, meet me at the docks the morning we depart." And then she walked away, leaving Scrap alone with the taste of warm bread still on her tongue and the sound of a promise echoing in her mind. That night, lying on her pallet, she couldn't sleep. Her eyes stayed open in the dark, staring at the cracked ceiling. For the first time in years, her thoughts didn't drift toward the next day's work. They drifted toward a ship, a crew she'd never met, and a human who looked at her like she was worth something. And for the first time in her life, Scrap didn't know if she wanted tomorrow to be the same as today. The days passed too quickly. Scrap worked as she always had, but her thoughts were no longer in the yard. They kept drifting to the human's words. "Come with me." It was such a small sentence, but it had cracked something open inside her. She had lived her whole life within the same few streets, the same gray buildings, the same endless noise of machines. She had never seen the sea, never seen a forest, never even seen the sky without smoke. And now, someone had looked at her and said she could leave. It didn't feel real. At night, lying on her pallet, she argued with herself in whispers no one else could hear. "If I leave, I don't know what will happen. If I stay, I already know what will happen." The human had not come back since making the offer. Scrap didn't know if that was because she was busy or because she wanted Scrap to decide, without pressure. Either way, the absence made the days feel longer. She watched the docks from a distance whenever she could, half hoping to catch sight of the ship, half hoping not to be, 'cause seeing it would make the choice more real. Fear wrapped itself around her like the cold at night. Out there, on that ship, she would be surrounded by strangers. What if they didn't like her? What if she wasn't useful? What if they realized she was nothing and sent her away in some empty port? But then another thought came, soft and dangerous. What if they didn't? One evening, after the work bell had rung and the yard was empty, she stayed behind. She sat on a crate, staring at her hands. They were calloused and scarred from years of lifting, carrying, scrubbing. Her fingernails were cracked. Her palms were rough. These were not the hands of someone who belonged on a ship that crossed the stars. But the human hadn't looked at her hands. She had looked at her face, at her eyes. And in that look, there had been something Scrap had never seen before: recognition. As if she were a person worth noticing. The night before the ship's departure, Scrap could not sleep. She lay on her side, curled beneath the thin blanket, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the wall. She thought about all the mornings that had been exactly the same. The bell, the bins, the shouting, the ache in her back. She thought about how the days blurred together until even the years felt like a single, endless shift. And she thought about the human's voice, calm but certain. You don't owe them anything. They've taken enough from you. When light crept into the room, she sat up. Her hands were trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of the choice she had already made. She didn't pack. There was nothing to pack. Everything she owned could be carried in her pockets, and none of it mattered. She stepped outside into the gray dawn. The streets were quiet. The factory chimneys were just beginning to cough smoke into the air. She walked past the workers, quarter without looking back. Every step toward the docks felt heavier than the last. Part of her wanted to turn around, to sink back into the familiar misery she knew. It was safer there. She knew the rules. Out here, beyond the yard, there were no rules for her. But the other part of her, the part that had kept her alive all these years, kept moving forward. When she reached the dock, the human ship was there, its ramp lowered, its engines humming softly. The air around it smelled faintly of ozone and fuel. The human was standing at the base of the ramp, speaking to a man with a data pad. When she saw Scrap, she stopped mid-sentence and smiled. It was the same smile as before, real and just. For her you came, the human said. Scrap swallowed. Yes. Good, the human said simply. Welcome aboard. For a heartbeat, Scrap just stood there, the sounds of the dock fading behind her. The world she had known was only a few steps away, but it already felt far. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in her life, stepped into the unknown. 2 weeks after Scrap joined the ship, she still felt like she was walking through someone else's life. The crew was different from anyone she had ever known. They laughed loudly, argued openly, and treated each other like equals, no matter their rank. No one ignored her here. They asked her questions, remembered her answers, and even taught her small jobs: checking seals on supply crates, sorting tools in the storage bay, cleaning the engine vents. It was strange. She was used to work being punishment, but here, work was just work. And when it was done, there was food, real food, and a place to rest that was warm and quiet. She was starting to think she might belong here. That thought was still fresh in her mind when the storm hit. The ship was crossing an asteroid belt, following a narrow path between spinning rocks. It should have been safe. The navigation charts marked it as a stable route, but the belt was alive that day. Something had shifted, and the warning alarms began to scream. Scrap was in the storage bay when the first impact shook the ship. The floor lurched, throwing her against a wall. Lights flickered, and somewhere above, metal groaned in protest. Then the captain's voice rang over the intercom. It was the human. All hands to stations. This is not a drill. We've got debris incoming. Scrap's heart hammered. She had no station. She had no training for this, but her feet were already moving, carrying her toward the sound of rushing voices in the main corridor. Crew members were running in every direction, some sealing bulkheads, others grabbing repair kits. The human spotted her and called out, "Scrap, with me." She followed without thinking. They sprinted toward the engineering section, where the ship's power core thrummed like a living heart. A cable had been torn loose from the ceiling, sparking wildly. Smoke hung in the air. "Hold this," the human shouted, shoving a heavy panel toward her. Scrap grabbed it, her arms straining under the weight. The ship shuddered again, and she stumbled, nearly dropping it. "Don't let go," the human yelled over the roar. She didn't. Her muscles burned, but she held on while the human worked, reconnecting wires and sealing the panel into place. Sparks bit at her skin, but she ignored them. Another impact rattled the walls, and a section of piping burst, spraying steam. The human swore under her breath and handed Scrap a small wrench. "Tighten that valve, now." Her hands shook, but she did as she was told, twisting until the steam stopped. The metal was hot under her fingers, and the air was heavy with the smell of burnt insulation. For the next few minutes, it was a blurring, holding, tightening, sealing. Every time the ship shook, her fear rose, but she kept moving. Finally, the human tapped her shoulder. "That's it, we're stable." The alarms quieted. The trembling stopped. In the silence that followed, Scrap realized her chest hurt from holding her breath. She looked around. The engineering section was a mess, but the core was still glowing, the lights were steady, and the ship was still flying. "You did good," the human said, smiling despite the soot on her face. "Couldn't have done that alone." Scrap stared at her, unsure how to answer. No one had ever told her she'd done well before. No one had ever said she was needed. When they stepped back into the corridor, some of the crew clapped her on the shoulder as they passed. A few even smiled at her. Later, when the danger had passed and the ship was gliding quietly through open space again, Scrap sat in the small cabin that was now hers. She thought about the storm, the chaos, the fear, and how she had not frozen. She had helped. She had made a difference. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was more than Scrap. Weeks passed after the storm, and Scrap began to feel the change deep in her bones. She no longer kept her eyes on the floor when someone spoke to her. She no longer flinched when someone called her name, well, the name they thought she had. The crew still called her Scrap, because she had never told them otherwise. But here, the word didn't feel sharp or cruel. It had become almost like a nickname, softened by laughter and shared meals. Still, it wasn't hers. She worked hard, not because she feared punishment, but because she wanted to. She cleaned, repaired, and learned. The crew taught her things. She had never imagined how to check oxygen levels, how to read navigation charts, how to use tools that could cut through steel as easily as cloth. Every night, she lay in her bunk and listened to the soft hum of the ship's engines. The sound was warm and steady, like the heartbeat of a giant animal that had accepted her as part of its body, and slowly, she began to believe she belonged here. One evening, the crew gathered in the mess hall for dinner. The long table was crowded, with plates of food, steaming mugs, and the constant sound of voices. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread. Scrap sat at the far end, still not used to sitting in the middle of things, but not hiding in the shadows anymore. The human her captain stood up, a mug in her hand. The chatter died down, all eyes turning toward her. "I've got something to say," the captain began, her voice carrying easily over the room. "When I landed on that miserable little planet, I didn't expect to find anyone worth taking with me. But I met someone who's proven me wrong." Scrap felt her stomach tighten. She kept her gaze on her plate, not wanting to believe the captain was talking about her, but knowing she was. "She's worked harder than anyone I've seen. She's learned fast, risked herself in the storm, and shown she's more than whatever that world tried to tell her she was." The captain's voice, softened, and I think it's time she had a real name. The mess hall was silent now. Scrap's hands tightened around her mug. The captain looked directly at her. Nova, she said. That's your name now. Means new star, bright, and seen from far away. For a moment, Scrap Novek couldn't move. The word hung in the air like something fragile and glowing. It didn't feel like a sound. It felt like a gift. She swallowed hard. Nova, she whispered, tasting it. It didn't feel heavy like Scrap had. It felt light, like a beginning. The crew raised their mugs to Nova. The cheer rolled through the room, warm and loud. Nova felt heat rise in her chest and up to her face. She couldn't remember the last time so many voices had spoken her name, her real name. Dinner went on, full of laughter and teasing. Nova barely touched her food. She kept thinking about how easy it had been for the captain to say those words, and how hard it was for her to believe them. Later that night, she stood alone in the observation deck. The stars stretched out in every direction, endless and bright. Somewhere down there was the world she had left, its skies still choked with smoke, its streets still ignoring the ones like her. She thought about the girl she had been, invisible, certain nothing would ever change. That girl was gone. She had stepped onto a ship with nothing, and now she had a crew, a home, and a name that belonged to her. Nova smiled, her reflection in the glass faint against the infinite dark. She hadn't just been given a new life. She had been given herself, and this time, she was never going back.